Hi friends, welcome. My name is Nilesh. In this video, we are going to see how to use Azure CLI or Azure command line interface to check for existence of resources. Let's get started. First thing, how do we get started with Azure CLI? You can search for Azure CLI and you will find that in this the docs.microsoft.com CLI Azure link. This contains all the references to the things related to Azure command line. So why is Azure command line or Azure CLI important? Nowadays we talk a lot about automation, and infrastructure as code is very good component when we talk about building continuous integration and continuous delivery cycles or deployment cycles. So Azure CLI plays a very important role in this, in which it helps us to automate things. It allows us to interact with Azure resources using the command line, and using the commands provided by Azure CLI, we can build automation around the different resources that we use in our day-to-day projects. So to get started, I will put a reference to this link in the description below. If you don't have the Azure CLI, you can go and get it installed. There are different ways. It's a cross-platform tool which supports Windows, Mac OS and Linux. It also has Docker container. You can run it as a Docker container without installing it on your machine. And there is also a Cloud Shell version of it. So if you log into the Azure portal, you can also access the Azure CLI when we click on the Cloud Shell. So let me quickly show you how to access this. I'm logged into my Azure portal here. If I click on this icon, the Cloud Shell, this is where I will have access to the Azure CLI. So while the Cloud Shell gets instantiated, let's see what is the version of Azure CLI. So we have two modes in the Cloud Shell. One is Bash, which is default, and the other one is PowerShell. Let me stick with Bash for the moment. And once the terminal is instantiated or I'm connected to the terminal, you can see here that I can type the AZ command to get started with Azure CLI. So let's fire some quick commands to see AZ, and if I want to see what is the version of the AZ CLI installed, you can see here that the current version which is installed in the Cloud Shell is 2.12, and there is the CLI core version and other examples or other versions. It contains multiple tools internally. So we have the core and then there is the CLI, and this can have different versions. Currently it is all 2.12. That's on the Cloud Shell. So let's come back to the local version. Let's say you don't want to work on the Cloud Shell and you want to work locally. So you can install using the steps here on your operating system, whichever one you are using, be it Windows, Mac OS or Linux. Different flavors of Linux are also supported. I work on Windows, so I have the Azure CLI installed here. I prefer Chocolatey. If you have seen one of my earlier videos where I talk about how to install packages or how to install software on your machine using Chocolatey, I can use Chocolatey to install Azure CLI as well. So I can search for Choco search, and if I give the name as Azure-CLI, I can find which is the latest version, and I can install that version using Chocolatey as well. So we can see here that 2.12.1 is the current version which is approved. And if I want to see, I've already installed using Chocolatey this version, so I can check what is the current version of the Azure CLI installed on my machine. So I have the latest version here. So you can see that the both CLI core as well as Azure CLI both are pointing to 2.12.1 version. So let's get started and see some of the commands which are provided by Azure CLI. The best way to learn any command line tool is to use the help ecosystem. And if we type the command AZ and --help, we will get the list of commands which are supported, or it's like a man page or the help page for this command. So we can see in the output here that it consists of different groups and subgroups. So basically this is like a top level or higher level command which has various sub commands. If you work with, let's say, Kubernetes, Docker or AWS CLI, the concept is similar here, or any other CLI for that matter. You have the top level command and then there are a list of sub commands which are supported. In this case, we can see that the AZ CLI or the AZ group command, which is the top level command, has various subgroups like account, then ACR, advisor, AKS. So these are all the services which are available on Azure portal or Azure in general, and we can interact with those services using these commands. So let's say first one that I want to check, or I want to use Azure CLI, is to see if a resource group exists. Resource group is very common concept in any of the services that we use. Most likely you will have to create a resource group and then put your resource inside that resource group. So whenever you create any sort of resource in Azure, you would invariably create a resource group in almost like more than 90% of the cases. So let's get started and see what is there for the resource group. So for the resource, I can use the top level group command or high level group command and then fire the help command to see what are the different options available or what are the different sub commands available under the resource group. So we can see here that for the group itself, AZ group, it is used to manage the resource group and template deployment. In terms of the subgroups and the commands that it has, it can be used to create a new resource or resource group, to delete a resource group, to check if the resource group exists, and then to list, export and show. So based on the type of resource, these sub commands which are there, they will vary. Let's start the first one, or let's look at the resource first. Now if I go into my portal, I know that there are some resources or some resource group which are already created, and I want to see if this resource group exists using the command line. So I have a resource group for the container registry, ACR container registry, named as ACR resource group. There is also the KeyVault AKV resource group. So let's go and check the properties of this AKV resource group using AZ CLI. So I start with AZ, then the group command, and let me again fire the help command once again and see which command can be used to find the details about the resource group. So we have the list command, we also have the show command. So let's try the first one, which is the list command, and see what are the things which are required here. So I can use this help at every level. So if I need what parameters are required to be passed to a particular command, I can always use help. So in this case, you can see that I'm using AZ group, and then for the specific list command, I'm not particularly sure what arguments are required. So I can use the help command to find out all those arguments. So you can see here that it only requires a tag argument if we have any tags, and the command is AZ group list. There are some global arguments, so I'll come to this in a short while, but we can see that we can list all the resources. So there are some examples here. The first example we see is list all resource groups located in West US region. I can fire this command saying AZ group list and then query, and I can give this filter in the query. So this query syntax uses something called as JMES query or JMESPath query. You can find out more about that on this JMESPath.org. So it has a specific syntax in which we can query for resources. So let's go and fire this command, AZ group list, and see what happens. And I get a list of resource groups. Since I didn't provide any filter, you can see that I've got a collection or a list, and this is all in the JSON format. Now this is where I would like to show you how to use the global parameters. So if I go and let's fire the help command again, you will see that there are some global parameters which were shown, and these global parameters or global arguments are applicable to any command. we can apply this to right from the top level command to any sub command. And we have these arguments like what is the level of debug or verbosity we want in our logs. Help, as I showed you, is applicable for all the commands. We can set other filters. The interesting one here is the output. So we can query or we can pass these arguments in either a full form or like a fully expanded format, which is a double hash or double dash and then the name of the command like output, or a short form which is single dash and then O. Not all commands they have both these formats. Like help, it has the expanded argument as well as the short form -h or -help, but the other commands they don't have. So in this case, let's focus our attention on the output command. Now let me go up and fire the same list command, but this time I want to show a different output. And if you look at the output, the type of outputs that we get is different formats which are allowed is JSON, JSON-C, none, table, TSV, YAML and YAML-C, and the default is JSON. Since we didn't specify any output format here, we saw that the output that we got from the previous command was JSON. Since we already saw JSON, now let me try the table format. So I will pass -- output and the type or the format as table, and you can see that in the table format the amount of information that it returns is very limited. So it returns just the name, location and status. This might be good enough just to list the basic information, but let's say I need additional information in that JSON output. If I go up or let me fire that query again and say I need JSON output now, you can see that there are a lot of details which are provided in the output which we can't see in the table format. So in JSON we can see it gives us the ID, location and additional information like managed by the properties, the tags, the type and various other things. The other part, which is my favorite, is instead of just getting a JSON output, I like to get it as a color coded JSON or JSON-C output. In this case, we get the same output, but it is color coded, and sometimes it is quite helpful. I personally find this helpful, that the name of the tag and the value are clearly identifiable based on the color. So now we have this JSON output, but sometimes I might not need all the output and I might not be interested in all these values. So that is where that query feature comes into the picture. So I will put a next line here or line separator, and I want to see, let's say, only few columns. I can put a query and I say I know there is a value or there is a field called as name. I want to just get the name. So in this case the output format is JSON-C, but I want to query it in the name. Looks like there is some problem. Let's try this. Okay, I know what's the reason. This is a list, and within that list we need to get the name. So I will come to this query a little bit later. So now what we saw here is a resource group and the details of the resource group, how we can query it using the format option or output option in the Azure CLI command for the group. Now let's say I want to check, since we are talking about automation and where this can be useful. One area is, if you are creating a resource, it's always better to check for the existence of the resource. So let me find out if this resource group exists. Now I know that this resource group exists, but how can I find this based on the command line, or how can I use Azure CLI to query this? So I can use the AZ group command, and I can use the show command now. Or even before we go to the show, let's say if we say exist name and I want to check for the AKV resource group. So before I fire this command, let me go back and show you what are the options available or what are the sub commands available for the group, which is for the resource group. Group is short form for resource group. So you can see here that there is a command called exist and it checks if the resource group exists. So this is exactly what we want to do here. So let me go and fire that command. So az group, and I want to check if it exists, and the parameter it takes is the name of the resource group, and I want to check if there is a resource group named AKV resource group. And we can see that it returns true because this resource group really exists. Now let's check with another one where the resource group doesn't exist. I don't have a resource group named as AKV resource group 1, and what I'm expecting here is the return value of false. So this is quite straightforward, and this can be used in our script or in our checks when we are trying to create a resource to see if the resource group already exists. This is good for the resource group, but not all resources have this exist command. So let me take an example. I have in my resources, so let me go back to the portal and let's look at some of the resources I have. So I have a SQL server named as SQL pass sg-server, and in the AZ CLI there is a SQL command. So I can go and I can look for AZ SQL, and at the SQL level I can manage SQL resources using this AZ SQL top level command or higher level command. So if you look at the different subgroups of the commands which are supported for AZ SQL, we have the db command to manage databases, we have dw command to manage data warehouses, and so on and so forth for the elastic group, failover group. But there is also a command specifically for server. So you can see here that this relates to managing of the SQL server. Now I'm going to use this for the next example. So AZ SQL and server. Now let's see what are the subgroup or sub commands available at the server level. This is for the SQL server. So we can see in the description here that this is used to manage SQL servers. We have subgroup commands for managing the Active Directory administrator, for the auditing policy, connection policy, DNS, and other things. And the commands which are available is create to create a SQL server, delete to delete the SQL server, list, show, update, and wait. So let's use the list command to list the available servers. So AZ SQL server, and if I use the list command here, we should get the list of SQL servers. And I have only one SQL server, so I get the details of that SQL server here. Now let's say I want to check if this server exists in my automation script. Let's say I'm trying to create a SQL server, and before I create a SQL server I need to check for an existence. So if we go back again and we look at the help, there is no exist command which is supported at the SQL server level. So you see the commands which are supported is only create, delete, list, and show, update, and wait. There is no exist command. How can we check for the existence? So we can use the show command to get details of the server, and then we can play a trick which I'm going to show you now to see if we return empty output, because we are getting output as a JSON. If the server doesn't exist, we will get an empty list, and then we can check if the list contains a value or not. So let me first show you what is the output that we would get if the server exists. So I'm going to use the same command, AZ SQL server, and I'm going to use now the show command. So the show command, let's see what parameters it takes. So So let's fire the help on the show command. And if we ignore the global arguments for the moment, what we need is the name of the server. So this can be passed as a fully qualified name like -- name, or a full form of the parameter name, or it can be used in short form with -name. And it also uses a resource group. So we can pass -- resource group, or the short form, which is -g. So let's do this. Now I need the show command, and I want to check for the name, and instead of doing a typo, let me take the name from a pre-created command. So I'm looking for the name of the server, which is SQL pass SG server, and along with the name I also need the resource group. So the name of the resource group is, in this case, the SQL pass resource group, SQL pass SG resource group. So based on these two parameters, I want to see what are the details for this SQL server. So if the SQL server exists, I would get this output in the JSON format, which is again the default since I didn't override the output parameter. Now I want to check based on this output, I already know that this particular SQL server exists. So the trick that I'm going to show you for the existence of a resource when it doesn't have an exist command is this. What we do is we use the query parameter. Now query can be used here to query for a particular property. So I know that there is a property named name in that collection, or in those values which are returned from the JSON. I want to query only the name. I'm not really worried about all the other properties. And if the name exists, or if the server exists, it would have a value for the name. And we can see that when we filter using the query parameter, the name, we get only the name of the SQL server. I can do the same thing for other properties which are nested properties. So let's say I want to look at a nested property, not the one which is at the top level like the kind or the state or name. We also have nested properties like identity, and I want to check, let's say, the type of identity. So I can use the same query and I can use the dot notation. So I can say identity and then the type, and I should get the nested value as well. So this query is really helpful to get the specific property. So that's what I was saying in the JMES query. So if you go back here and sorry, not in this, when we do the help, there is this JMES query. Let me type it here. So where is the help command that we were using? Okay. So this query supports JMES query, and this is a query format which is used, JMESPath query. So this is the format which is used to query information inside JSON. It has a specific syntax, like the if you are working with XML, we have the XML query format, XPath. Similar to that, for JSON, it has the JMESPath. So now let's go and search for this name. So I found the name. How do I use this to verify whether the server exists or not in the automation? The trick here is I can store this in a variable. So let me go back here and save this output into a variable, and let me name that variable as SQL server name. So I'm running the same command again, and I'm storing the output, and I can echo what is the value of this SQL server name. So it's the same output that we saw earlier. Now what I can do is I can check here that the SQL Server name length of this is greater than 0. Let's go up. So you can see here that when we find the length and we check that it is greater than 0, we get true. And let's try the same command with a SQL Server name which doesn't exist. So here, let me go and change the name of the SQL Server to, let's add 1 here in the name, because I don't have this server and I'm populating that same SQL Server name value, or repopulating that. Once the command is run, we see that we get an error because this server in the resource group, it doesn't exist. This is normal because the server is not present at the moment. Now if we run the same command to see if the length is greater than 0, we get false. So this can be used to this technique can be used to see if the resource exists. So basically every resource in the Azure will have this list or show command, which will be using different parameters like the name, the resource group. So we can query the show command, or we can query the Azure resource portal or Azure resources using show command, passing the name and the resource group. If the resource exists, we would get a value, and then we can put a filter on the query. Here I'm using name, but it can be any other value that is returned in the JSON output, or whatever format of the output we are using. And then we can query if the length of that particular value that we are checking is greater than 0 or not. If it is greater than 0, that means the resource exists and we are able to find a match. If it is less than 0, or if it is equal to 0, that means the resource didn't exist in the portal. And this is what I have been using for some of my scripts where I use Azure CLI very heavily. This is an example of initializing an AKS cluster where I check for the existence of the resource group using the exist method, or using the exist filter, and then once the resource group exists, I can check for the existence of Azure Kubernetes Service Cluster. So before I go into creating the cluster, I fire this query AKS show, and based on the resource group and name of the cluster, I query the name, and the same logic that I showed just now. If the length is greater than 0, that means I'm sure the cluster exists. If it doesn't exist, only then I go ahead and create it. So I showed this for the SQL Server. Let me show you the same thing for one more resource, which is the KeyVault. I have in my subscription, if we go back to Azure portal, there is a KeyVault. So I have a resource group called AKV resource group, and in this resource group there is a KeyVault instance created. So let me check what is the name, ngAKV. Now let's use the same technique here to check for the existence of the KeyVault. So for working with KeyVault, we have az KeyVault as the top level command, and let's run again the show and the help for the show command. By now I assume that you know how to work with the help command. So instead of going and doing az KeyVault and help, I directly drill down to the show level because I know there is a show command, and you can see that it again takes the name of the resource or the KeyVault and the resource group name. So let's go and fire this az KeyVault show, and instead of help, now we are going to use the name ngAKV, and let's query the name of this, and the output that I want in this case is the tab separated values, or TSV. So we can see here that it is able to get the ngAKV. So in this case, it is not mandatory to pass the resource group name. Just with the name of the resource, it's able to find. Let's change the format here to table and see what happens. We get only one result because I have output a query. Let me remove the query parameter and see what are the other values that the KeyVault returns. When we run the show command, the output of the show and the format as table. I'm not sure why is it taking such a long time. We cancel this. Okay, in the interest of the time, let's go and fire the command on a different window. So AZ KeyVault show and maybe it is due to the spaces here, extra spaces. Let me just trim that. Yeah, so you can see here that it returns the location, name and the resource group. So going back, let me use the same command here, and I want this as, let's say, JSON C, color coded JSON, and I want to store it into a variable. So AKV ng, actually color coded JSON doesn't matter here, so let me just get it as JSON because we are storing it into a variable, and putting a color coded or non color coded value will be the same. Echo, let's see if we have the value. Yes, so we got the value and we can use the same technique here. So this dot length is greater than 0, then we know that this value exists or this KeyVault exists, and that is how we can verify. So again, to verify that at the KeyVault level, do we have the exist method or not, we can run AZ KeyVault and help. And when we look at the commands here, we can again see there is no exist command on the KeyVault. And as I said earlier, this type of commands, they vary based on the type of resource. So in case of SQL Server, we saw a different set of commands which were related to the SQL Server or SQL. And when we talk about the KeyVault, we can see that the supported commands, they are different. So the number of commands or the sub command, they vary based on the type of the service. So with that, it brings me to the end of this video. This approach which I showed using the JSON output, James query, and then doing the length check, it is not specific just to the Azure CLI. This can be used with other CLI tools as well. If you want to check for existence and if they return a JSON output, we can use this technique where a feature like exist doesn't exist on the command line. So I hope you found this useful. In case you find this video useful, please hit the like button, subscribe the channel, and don't forget to subscribe and help grow this channel. Thank you for watching this video. Until next time, code with passion and strive for excellence. Thank you. Thanks for watching once again.